My name is Claire, and before all of this, I was just an ordinary nurse in an ordinary hospital, living an ordinary life in a city that chewed up and spit out people like me every single day. My days were a blur of endless shifts, overworked nights, cold coffee, and thankless patients. I spent years clawing my way through medical school, only to end up buried under student loans, and a gnawing emptiness that only grew worse with every passing week. The kind of emptiness you don't notice until it's too late, and by then, it's woven itself so tightly into your bones that it feels like breathing. I had no family to speak of, no one waiting at home, just a cheap apartment that smelled of mildew no matter how much I cleaned, and a broken radiator that clanked like the bones of some ancient creature in the middle of the night. So when I found the flyer tucked beneath my windshield wiper on that freezing November evening, I thought at first it was some scam. The flyer was simple, printed on black paper with silver ink that shimmered under the street lights. Now hiring, night nurse, high pay, housing provided, inquire within. No hospital name, no address, just a set of GPS coordinates and a phone number written in jagged handwriting that seemed almost to crawl across the page. Something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was the promise of escape, or maybe it was the silent desperation that had been building inside me like a storm I couldn't contain. Either way, I called the number without really knowing why. The voice that answered was low and clipped, giving me terse directions to a place I'd never heard of on the outskirts of town. When I asked for details, the voice simply said, "Show up, bring nothing but yourself, be ready to work," and then hung up before I could stammer a reply. Everything about it screamed danger, but danger was better than drowning slowly in a life that felt more like a tomb every day. The coordinates led me through twisting, forgotten roads that seemed to weave themselves into knots the deeper I drove into the woods. There were no streetlights, no signs, only the dim glow of my headlights bouncing off skeletal trees, and the occasional flutter of something too fast and too wrong to be an animal darting across the road. Just when I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, I found myself staring up at the hospital. It was an enormous, crumbling building, all sharp angles and looming towers, like something ripped straight from the fevered dream of a mad architect. The gates swung open soundlessly as I approached, and I drove through without thinking, too numb, too tired, too hollow to do anything else. Inside, a woman was waiting for me at the entrance. She wore a nurse's uniform like mine, but older, more formal. Her face was ageless, not young, not old, and her eyes gleamed with something that was not quite human. She didn't offer a greeting, only handed me a folded piece of paper and said, "Read this carefully before you start your shift." And then she was gone, swallowed by the maze of corridors beyond. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, the ink shimmering like the flyer, and when I unfolded it, my breath caught in my throat. At the top were the words, "Rules for Survival," and beneath it, a list so strange and so terrifying that for a moment I thought this was all some elaborate joke. But the silence pressing against me from all sides was too thick, too oppressive to be anything but real. The rules were simple and horrifying. 1. Always knock 3 times before entering any patient's room, even if the door is open. 2. Never respond to your name if you hear it whispered behind you. 3. If you hear scratching inside the walls, do not investigate. 4. At 3:33 a.m. precisely, administer the red vial to room 616 without making eye contact. 5. If a patient offers you a gift, politely decline, no matter what. 6. If the lights flicker, recite the hospital's oath aloud without stopping until they stabilize. 7. Do not, under any circumstances, use the elevator after midnight. 8. If you see a second version of yourself walking the halls, avoid eye contact and take the nearest staircase to the basement. And 9. If you survive until sunrise, clock out without speaking to anyone and leave immediately. My hands were trembling as I finished reading, but when I looked up, the world around me had already shifted. The doors that once led back to my car were gone, replaced by endless stretches of hallway that stretched out in every direction, pulsing faintly with a sickly green light. There was no way out but forward. And maybe a part of me welcomed that, because for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't tired, I wasn't empty, I was terrified. And terror, at least, was something that made me feel alive. My first shift started the moment I stepped beyond the reception desk, the clock on the wall ticking over to midnight with a loud, shuddering clang. And I realized then that there was no quitting this job. Not anymore. I was the new night nurse in a hospital for monsters, and if I wanted to live to see another dawn, I would have to follow the rules. The first few hours of my shift passed in a sickly haze of fear and confusion. The corridors stretched out endlessly before me, flickering under the dim green lights. The silence so thick it wrapped around me like wet cloth. Every step echoed too loudly, as if the building itself was listening. The first rule was easy enough to remember. I knocked 3 times before entering each room, even when the doors were wide open and shadows slithered across the floors. Most of the patients were things I couldn't look at directly, their bodies shifting and writhing beneath stained sheets, some breathing wetly, some clicking their jaws in patterns that made my skin crawl. It wasn't until I reached room 237 that I forgot to knock, just for a moment, distracted by the sound of my name whispered in a child's voice behind me. I froze, remembering the second rule. But instinct won over training, and I turned slightly toward the sound. There was nothing there, only a long smear of something black dripping down the wall. I shuddered and knocked belatedly, then stepped into the room. The patient inside was little more than a pale blur, something wrapped tight in bandages from head to toe, its body quivering in slow, rhythmic jerks like a marionette dangling from broken strings. I backed out of the room as quickly as I could, but I felt something cold and unseen brush against my neck as I pulled the door shut, leaving a wet mark that burned against my skin like a brand. After that, time became slippery. I lost track of how long I wandered the corridors, how many doors I passed that had no numbers, just deep scratches gouged into the wood. I felt eyes watching me from air vents, from under beds, from the thin cracks between the floor tiles. At one point, the lights began to flicker, and I nearly forgot the 6th rule, my mind locking up in terror as the hallway around me twisted into something darker, less solid. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, their mouths gaping silently. I fumbled the paper out of my pocket and read the oath aloud, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form the words. By blood and bone, by night and stone, I serve and shield until I'm gone. Over and over until the light steadied. But even then, something new had entered the hallway, something heavy, wet and breathing. I didn't wait to see it. I ran, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would hear me. When I finally slowed, gasping for breath, I found myself standing before room 616. The clock on the wall read 3:32 a.m. I clutched the small red vial in my hand so tightly I thought it might crack, remembering the 4th rule. I pushed the door open with my elbow and stumbled inside, refusing to make eye contact with whatever was waiting in the bed. The thing in the bed rasped wetly, its body a heaving mass of stitched flesh, arms too long, mouth sewn shut across its stomach, legs bent backward at the knees. I didn't look up, didn't breathe, just jabbed the vial into the IV line and pushed the liquid in. The room immediately filled with the sound of low, growling laughter, and I backed out so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The moment I was back in the hallway, I slammed the door and ran. I thought it would end there, but the hospital wasn't done with me yet, not by a long shot. As I rounded a corner near the east wing, something moved in front of me. My heart stopped when I saw her, a perfect copy of myself standing barefoot in the middle of the hall, her hair limp, her eyes hollow, her smile stretching too wide across her face. She cocked her head, mimicking me like a puppet, and I remembered the 8th rule. Without thinking, I threw myself through the nearest stairwell door, tumbling down the concrete steps until I crashed against the basement floor. The air here was worse, thick with rot and buzzing with the sound of something huge moving in the dark. But it was better than facing whatever that thing pretending to be me wanted. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled through the basement. the walls covered in pulsing veins that twitched when I brushed against them. Something brushed my leg and I screamed, but when I looked down, it was only a severed hand, dragging itself along by its fingers, seeking something to latch onto. I kicked it away and bolted through the maze of storage rooms and boiler pipes, every step feeling like it would be my last. Finally, I found a service stairwell that led back up, and I didn't stop climbing until I burst out onto the main floor again, shaking so badly I could barely stand. But it didn't matter, because the sky beyond the cracked windows was beginning to lighten, just the faintest tinge of grey on the horizon. It wasn't sunrise yet, but it was close. I made my way back toward the reception desk, every nerve screaming that I was being followed, something slithering just at the edges of the light, whispering promises in voices that sounded like long-dead loved ones. I didn't look back, didn't answer, just kept moving until I finally saw the clock click over to 6 a.m. I remembered the final rule. I clocked out without speaking a word and made my way to the doors. This time they were there, standing wide open to the outside world. I stumbled out into the dawn light, gasping like a drowning woman breaking the surface of the sea. I collapsed onto the gravel and stared back at the hospital, its dark windows watching me, knowing I would return tonight, and the next night, and the next. Because once you start working here, you don't get to leave. Not unless they let you. And they never, ever let you go. The second night was worse, much worse. The fear I carried back into that hospital was a living thing, heavy and sharp. It gnawed at my ribs and clung to my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to drive until the hospital was just a bad dream behind me. But when I tried to stay away, I found myself back on the same broken road, my hands gripping the wheel without my permission, my vision blurring until the only thing I could see was the looming black silhouette of that cursed building. I didn't even remember getting out of the car, my body moving like a puppet yanked along invisible strings. When I stepped through the doors, the world inside swallowed me whole again. The green lights flickered. The air buzzed with low, bone-deep growls, and the rules were waiting in my pocket, heavier now, like they had soaked up something from the hospital itself. The first few hours were a sick blur of screams from unseen rooms, blood dripping slowly from cracks in the ceiling, and patients that stared at me with empty sockets where their eyes should have been. I kept knocking before entering any room, even when a patient begged me not to knock, sobbing from the other side of the door, pleading in a voice that sounded so heartbreakingly human. But I didn't listen, because I remembered the rules, and I knew the thing behind that door wasn't really a patient anymore. The air grew colder as the night stretched on, every hallway warping into something less solid, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal flesh, pulsing and twitching like it was breathing. Around 2 a.m., I heard the scratching in the walls, soft at first, almost ignorable, but it grew louder, more frantic, claws raking against metal and wood and bone. I clenched my fists and kept walking, tears burning in my eyes as something inside the walls tracked my every step, pacing me, matching my movements with terrifying precision. The temptation to peek inside one of the vents was unbearable, the need to know clawing at my mind, but I forced myself to look straight ahead, not daring to even glance sideways. I don't know how long I wandered like that, the corridors looping impossibly, doors shifting places when I wasn't looking, the hospital changing itself like a living maze designed to break me. At some point, the lights above me began to dim, not flicker, but dim. A slow, agonizing fade that turned the world into a swamp of shadows. I dropped to my knees and began reciting the hospital's oath, the words tumbling from my lips in broken sobs. Something moved toward me through the dark, tall and skeletal, its mouth stretching open to reveal endless rows of jagged teeth. But as I kept chanting, it recoiled, retreating back into the gloom, leaving behind the stench of sulfur and rot. I staggered to my feet and kept going, praying for sunrise, praying for anything to pull me from this nightmare. But the hospital had other plans. When the clock struck 3:33 a.m., I realized with a jolt of horror that I had lost the red vial. I tore through my pockets, searching, my breath hitching in panic. Because if I didn't deliver it to room 616, something worse than death would come for me. That was when I heard my own voice calling me, soft and sweet. From down the hall, it promised it had the vial, promised I just had to follow. I clamped my hands over my ears and ran the opposite way, but the hospital shifted under my feet, dragging me toward the sound, forcing me closer to the thing that wore my voice like a mask. When I reached room 616, I found the vial lying neatly on the ground before the door, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I grabbed it and stumbled into the room, refusing to look at the patient, feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes boring into me from every angle. I jabbed the vial into the IV and emptied it. But this time, the thing in the bed didn't just laugh, it screamed, a high-pitched, brain-shredding wail that made the walls bleed. I stumbled out, clutching my ears, my nose gushing blood, and collapsed against the wall, shaking and sobbing. But I was still alive, somehow, barely. I didn't have the luxury of catching my breath, because the elevator at the end of the hall dinged open, and something stepped out, something wearing my face, my uniform. But wrong. Everything about it wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It grinned at me with a mouth full of black teeth, and then it began to run, sprinting straight at me on all fours like a monstrous spider. I screamed and bolted for the nearest staircase, knowing that if it caught me, there would be no surviving. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The air behind me warped and twisted, the thing shrieking in rage, slamming into walls, tearing through doors. Always just a heartbeat behind me, I hit the stairs hard, barreling down into the basement again. But this time, the basement was worse. The walls were made of faces now, hundreds of them, screaming silently, mouths stretched open in agony, their eyes following me wherever I moved, hands reaching out from the concrete to claw at my ankles. I kicked and fought and stumbled forward, guided only by the faintest glimmer of light ahead somehow. I found the service stairs again and dragged myself up, each step feeling like an eternity. The hospital didn't want me to leave this time. It fought me, the walls groaning, the lights exploding in showers of sparks, the floor tilting beneath my feet. But I clawed my way upward, inch by agonizing inch, until finally I burst onto the main floor, gasping and wild-eyed, the sun just beginning to rise beyond the windows. The clock over the reception desk ticking over to 6 a.m. with a loud, merciful clang. I clocked out without speaking, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen, and stumbled into the cool morning air, my mind shattered, my soul bruised, but alive. I looked back one last time at the hospital, its windows dark and empty, but I knew it was watching, waiting, knowing that I would return again, because I had no choice. Because once you start working here, you belong to it, body and soul, forever. The third night felt like a death sentence, the moment I stepped out of my car and faced the hospital looming against the starless sky. The building looked more alive than ever, pulsing with a sick rhythm, its windows bleeding black ichor that steamed against the cold night air. My legs moved without my permission, dragging me through the front doors into the rotting heart of the nightmare. Again, the rules were still in my pocket, the list now so worn and crumpled it barely held together. But it didn't matter, because deep inside me, I knew that tonight the rules wouldn't be enough. The corridors were already wrong, the walls breathing in and out like a massive beast, the floor twitching under my shoes like it was trying to shake me loose. The lights didn't flicker anymore, they simply hovered in the dark, cold and green, and watching. I clenched my fists and began my rounds, forcing myself to knock 3 times before every door, even when something on the other side shrieked at me, begging me to come in without knocking, even when the floor behind me hissed and cracked and split open as something massive crawled after me tonight. Every inch of the hospital was awake. Every monster patient and everything that didn't have a name was moving, hunting, hungering. The scratching inside the walls became screaming. The air vents bled tar and teeth. The ceiling sagged low enough to brush my hair and whisper threats into my ears. The oath didn't help. This time the hospital was past caring about promises. I was nothing but meat to it now, and it was almost time to collect when I reached room 616. I found the door already open. Inside, the patient wasn't in the bed anymore. It was standing in the center of the room, its stitched body unraveling black threads slithering out of its wounds to weave themselves into the air around it. It looked at me with dozens of glassy dead eyes and smiled a smile that was too wide, too human, and it spoke in a chorus of voices. All the patients, all the monsters, all the nurses who had come before me. It told me that my time was up, that there was no escaping my shift this time. My hands moved on their own, pulling the last red vial from my pocket, my fingers slick with cold sweat and blood. I lunged forward, jamming the vial into the creature's pulsing mass. The vial shattered, sending a shockwave through the room that ripped the walls apart. The hospital screamed around me, 1,000 mouths crying out in rage and pain. The ground buckled, the air shattered into jagged shards of light and darkness, and for the first time since I started working here, the building itself staggered, as if I had wounded it. I didn't think I just ran sprinting down the collapsing hallway, dodging falling chunks of ceiling, ducking the grasping hands that sprouted from the walls. I could feel the stitched creature chasing me, its many legs skittering across the broken floor. The lights above exploded one after another, plunging everything into oily blackness. But ahead of me, just barely visible there, it was the front door, standing wide open, sunlight streaming through it, pure and golden and real. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming every step, a battle against the hospital's rage. Something grabbed my ankle, pulling me down onto the broken tiles, sharp claws digging into my flesh, but I kicked and clawed and dragged myself forward, sobbing and screaming until I broke free. Something roared behind me, a deep, primal sound that shook the walls and split the floor wide open. But I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The sunlight was inches away. I could feel its warmth on my skin. Real warmth, not the cold imitation of life. The hospital breathed into its victims. I dove forward, hurling myself through the doorway as the hospital let out one final howl of fury. The doors slammed shut behind me so hard the ground shook, and then there was silence. I lay there gasping on the gravel, my body broken and bleeding, but alive, really alive. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stared up at the sky, watching the clouds drift across a brilliant blue expanse, the sun burning away the chill that had wrapped itself around my bones for 3 endless nights. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body trembling, and looked back at the hospital. But it was gone. Only an empty field remained, cracked and blackened, as if something had been torn out of the earth, leaving a scar that would never heal. The rules were gone from my pocket, the vials, the paper. Everything vanished like smoke carried away on the wind. I knew deep down that the hospital wasn't truly destroyed, just wounded, sleeping, waiting to heal, waiting to lure someone else in, but not me, not anymore. I staggered to my feet, feeling the grass under my hands, feeling the real world anchoring me again, and I walked away without looking back. This time, I survived, not because I was stronger or smarter, but because sometimes the darkness spits you out just to see how long you can last in the light.